Not all Bravs are back with Moss without Venus, a study of some homosexual generals. Major General Frank M. Richardson. I believe this is chapter 3. I've already started it, and I started it again yesterday, but my phone stopped and swallowed the video, so I must redo it. Frederick II. Obviously, we did, what was his name yesterday? Let me look. We did Alexander the Great first. Now we're on Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great is so much nearer our own time than the heroes and villains of classical history that it is easier to examine his life story. There are many more biographies, and the facts are not overlaid by myth or legend. Accurate descriptions of his physical appearance exist, and we have the opinions of some contemporary admirers and critics. Frederick's family background was the opposite of the kind said to predispose boys to homosexuality. His overpowering and terrifying father loomed perpetually over his young life, whilst his ineffectual mother made herself scarce, her main purpose in life being to arrange a double marriage for Frederick and his sister Wilhelmine with the English royal family. She never brought it off. Frederick was an engaging little boy. Though highly strung and nervous, he was always inclined to be self-critical, and he genuinely longed for the love and approval of his father, so much so that it was believed that he rejoiced in his early military successes, partly because he felt they would have pleased his father. He grew into a man with a delightful gift for friendship, including friendship with a few women, but the one abiding love of his life was for his sister Wilhelmine. Her death plunged him into the deepest of all the depths of misery in his life, and he confessed to feeling suicidal. His first thoughts of suicide, however, were when he was quite young and was driven to desperation by the brutality of his father, whom he loved and longed unavailingly to please. Except on one notorious occasion referred to later, Frederick was completely stoical about his sufferings at his father's hands, which were truly horrible. From unqualified detestation of the terrible Frederick, William I of Prussia, whose cruelty were a byword throughout Europe, I was driven to a half unwilling sympathy on learning from a remarkable book by Doctors Ida Malkapine and MacAlpine and Robert Hunter that he was among the descendants of Mary, Queen of Scots, who suffered from a strange metabolic disorder called porphyria. A genealogical table in the book shows all those who inherited a share of the genes of that tragic queen, and indicates those in whose cases the characteristics red or purple urine can be identified. Poor Mary was not even granted the support of good health to help her to endure her tribulations. Doctors McAlpine and Hunter also publish a table showing how the disorder was transmitted from the House of Tudor to the House of Stuart. A truly distinguished piece of medical detective work. Some doctors remain not entirely convinced by their findings. For example, Dr. Jeffrey Dean. Porphyria is a hereditary disturbance of the metabolism of porphyrins. Porphyrins? Purple, red pigments contained in every cell of the body, which give the blood its red color. The disease is transmitted as a Mendelian recessive character and affects mainly males. The excess of porphyrins in the blood causes widespread intoxication of the nervous system with nervous and mental symptoms. The sufferer has attacks in which he is extremely ill, sometimes paralyzed, and in agonizing pain, often taken for rheumatism or gout. The doctors who looked after Frederick William, his son Frederick, and another victim, George III, on whom they inflicted outrageously horrible treatment, which made him worse, cannot be blamed For their ignorance, this awful malady was not then recognized or understood, and even today cases are often not recognized and have been mistaken for acute abdominal emergencies, delirium tremens, depression, schizophrenia, and acute anxiety states. Before reading McAlpine and Hunter's book, I had retained from my own education only the last jaunty line of a limerick, and porphyrinuria. This was so as much use to me as was the last one of another limerick, in the diagnosis of nervous disease, and dysdiadochokinesia. Indeed, the only mnemonic, which did help me, and also provided a nice insight into Greek cultural activity, was one for the cranial nerves on old Olympus, tapering tops of fat-arsed Grecian virgin actively hops. How do medical students ever grow into respected doctors? And I must comment that when I first read that yesterday on that ill-fated video, I was as repulsed as I am now. It's just an ignorant aside that didn't need to be put into a book. Nancy Mitford's powerful biography, Frederick the Great, published in 1970, is the first to give prominence to these researches. Alan Palmer, writing 4 years later in Frederick the Great, though describing Frederick's chronic gout, stomach pains, tortured body, does not mention the true cause. He is, to put it mildly, reticent about Frederick's homosexuality, as befits a schoolmaster whose book will be added to the school library. Suspicion might have been aroused by the purplish complexion shown in portraits of Frederick William's gross face, though this is not stressed as a clinical sign. Purple coloration affected George III's chamber pot rather than his face. A reliable sign for posterity to observe. In his worst attacks, Frederick William became extremely disturbed mentally, and his temper grew more and more violent and uncontrollable. When he attempted to distract himself by painting, he pathetically signed his pictures Fredericus Wilhelminus in Tormentis Pinsic. I don't know how to pronounce an X in Latin, let alone Latin itself. When he died, his face was a mask of torture. Realization that his father's brutality was due to illness might have made it easier for Frederick to bear. Frederick himself had his first attack in 1740 when he was 28, and thereafter he was never completely well again. He never became violent or mentally disturbed, as did his father and George III, who went quietly mad and never inflicted corporal punishment on Prinny, who probably deserved more than did poor, gentle Frederick. It might have done him good. George III did occasionally show violence and needed restraint, and he once struck a page. A writer of fiction who faithfully depicted a character like Frederick William would surely be accused of exaggeration. He liked to play a part in the training of his army, forging the weapons which his son would use so effectively. He collected from all over Europe giant grenadiers for his guard, resorting to kidnapping when purchase or normal methods of recruiting failed. These giants, often rather slow-witted oafs, were frequently severely beaten by the king himself. Even civilians were not safe, and the best-known story tells of him catching a man trying to hide from him as he walked through the streets and asking him why he did so. The man confessed that he was afraid of his king and received a good caning, accompanied by the memorable admonition, "You're supposed to love me, you scum." But the most constant victim was Frederick, whose effeminate manner and artistic interest infuriated his father, who, like many fathers, felt that his son and heir should try to resemble him as much as possible. Surprisingly enough, the dirty, coarse-fibered king had been something of a fop in his early days, but by the time Frederick was born, he had put all that behind him and had become boorish and slovenly. It was his pride to share the privations of his troops on maneuvers, even when increasing corpulence and ill health made this inadvisable. He in his uniform and boots. He scorned comfortable quarters suitable to his rank and slept in barns in his uniform and boots. Maybe I should keep my finger here so I quit losing place. Great was the contrast between him and his elegant son, posturing and rhapsodizing about culture among his aesthetic friends. Portraits of the young crown prince make him look like Alexander, too pretty for a man. The evidence of the portrait painters is confirmed by contemporary descriptions of the rather plump and somewhat feminine person of the prettiest, daintiest majesty in the world. His hips too big and his legs too thick for the perfectly manly figure, with curly hair, big blue eyes, and very white hands loaded with rings, as the hands of homosexual men are apt to be. Now, I don't think I know many homosexual men, but maybe I'll just start looking for dudes that are adorned with rings. Never heard of that. Maybe that was, I guess this was back in the 80s. Someone who saw him as a child playing with his sister found it impossible to say which was the boy and which the girl. When he was grown up, a man who saw him at his brother's wedding said that he would have fallen in love with him had he been of the opposite sex. Nancy Mitford describes him, at a somewhat earlier time, as a particularly thin and peaky boy, whose face seemed to contain only two enormous blue eyes, dazzling as the sun. It was Frederick's misfortune that his personality constantly drove his father to a state of sadistic frenzy, in which he would assault his son, beat and humiliate him, often in public, and in a manner which actually brought protests from other sovereigns. Still more unbearable were the sarcastic taunts and denunciations of the crown prince as a useless fop. Outbursts of cruelty alternated with exaggerated endeavors to secure the affection of his son, when he would weep and embrace him, throwing the boy's mind into confusion and renewing hopes of gaining his father's love and approval. Frederick would beg for his father's forgiveness and understanding, with humble, filial piety, which was so grossly overdone that he would actually kiss the king's feet. During Frederick's childhood, his tutors were strictly enjoined never to threaten him with punishment from his father, but only from his mother. She was quite unable to cope with her husband's erratic, psychopathic personality, though she did make feeble attempts to shield her son from violence. Frederick, in fact, could never rely on either parent for the love, support, and approval which are so important for a happy psychological development. Such an upbringing could hardly fail to cause some instability of temperament, and it is a wonder that Frederick retained so much warmth and affection in his nature, and was not warped even more by his father's unpredictable cruelty. The most tragic example was the king's savage treatment of a young man, a little older than Frederick, who was his closest friend, and nearer to him in rank than many of his male friends. This was Lieutenant Hans Hermann von Katt, the son of a distinguished Lieutenant Hans Hermann, the son of a distinguished general. His friendship with Frederick led him to a cruel death that Frederick's own ill-conceived rash actions led to the terrible sequel makes it all no easier to contemplate. Driven to desperation by his father's insane cruelty and the humiliation of public beatings, which were resented more and more as he grew older, Frederick resolved to escape to England with Cott and another close friend, Keith, whose younger brother, one of the king's pages, broke down and betrayed the plot to Frederick William. The older Keith escaped, but Cott was arrested, and he and the crown prince were tried for treason by separate courts-martial. The king refused to allow the prince's judges to declare themselves incompetent to try the heir to the throne, and insisted on a sentence of death. possibly in order that his royal pardon might further his plan for softening what he persisted in calling his son's hard heart. The softening process might well have unhinged a man less stable than Frederick's. Dressed in prison clothing and still, for all he knew, under sentence of death, he was compelled to witness the decapitation of his bosom friend on a scaffold, erected for the purpose outside the window of Frederick's prison cell in the castle of Custrin. The court-martial had sentenced Cat to life imprisonment, but the terrible king changed the sentence to that of death, and answered anguished appeals from the youth's father by saying, "Your son is a canaille," whatever it is that, "and so is mine. There is nothing we can do about it." Frederick had begged to be allowed to sacrifice his life for his friend, and as Cat was led to the scaffold, Frederick blew him a kiss from the window of his cell and shouted repeated pleas for forgiveness. Cot, who remained serene, possibly because he believed the horrible scene was play acting, and he was to be reprieved at the last moment, bowed and said, "Monseigneur, there is nothing to forgive." Naturally, there are many versions of what was said on this dreadful occasion. Some historians have settled for Frederick, "Mon cher Cot, je vous demande pardon mille fois." Cot, "Monseigneur, n'en pensez." You can read the rest then. I don't know what I'm saying. Carlyle preferred "La mort est douce pour un si amiable prince." Frederick years later told his secretary, Cot, that he had been forced against the window by grenadiers who held his head. Von Cott knelt in prayer, and his head was struck off by the executioner. As the sword fell, Frederick fainted, but revived to see the body lying beside the blood-soaked pile of sand, which he was convinced was awaiting the head of the next victim, his own. His premonition of impending death was strengthened when Pastor Muller, whom he had just seen accompanying Cat to the scaffold, entered his cell in accordance with the king's personal order. Before the executioner had finished wiping his sword to carry on the good work of softening Frederick's heart. Not surprisingly, it worked. After a considerable bout of delirium, hysterical weeping, and mourning for Cot, the relief of realizing that he was not to die after all brought him to heel. "You think?" He wrote an abject letter of gratitude and submission to his father, and settled down in Custrin to a spell of penal servitude. "My spell at the galleys," he called it, learning all about provincial administration. The experience helped him to understand the business of government. Yeah, if you don't do what your father says, you're getting fucking beheaded, bro. Good lesson in civil obediency. The official reason for all this terrible severity was that the crown prince and all who had aided him in attempting to escape from his country had been guilty of treason, but it is generally accepted that the king was impelled to exceptional harshness by suspicion that his son and Cat had been lovers. It is possible that he really intended to execute Frederick, but was deterred by appeals from other rulers and by his recollection of the unfortunate stir created 12 years before, when Peter the Great had his son Alexei flogged to death. The plotters had been pathetically incompetent, and rumors in court circles about their suspicious behavior had reached Frederick William's ears, confirming his own suspicions that Cott's influence in his family was a bad one. Quite why, his muddled mind seems not to have decided. He once drew his sword to kill Frederick, but instead took his cane and drew blood on Frederick's face. He grew angrier and angrier, until, in Mrs. Mitford's words, there was a reign of terror. Foreign diplomats describing it to their governments hardly expected to be believed. Frederick William beat and kicked Wilhelmine, shouting that he knew she had a baby by Cot. He then lurched after the smaller children, who scattered in a fright. He might have killed one of them had not Madame de Camac lost her temper with him and cried out, "Go to the devil, but leave these children alone." Although the king thanked Madame the Camac next day, his extraordinary conduct continued. In the wake of the Cot purge, other friends of Frederick were imprisoned, and even his innocent sister, the scum Wilhelmina, sick, was threatened with execution. Desperately anxious about the developing pattern of his son's life, which was patently homosexual, the king's illogical mind accepted wildly improbable stories of different affairs, including one with Princess Amelia of England, whom Frederick had never seen. Frederick persuaded himself that he was in love with Princess Amelia, perhaps to fall in with his mother's plans, but mainly to get away from his family. Above all, he longed for a separate establishment and was astonished when Frederick William suddenly, why do I keep wanting to call him Wilhelm? Frederick William suddenly allowed him to live at Rheinsberg with a small entourage of his own. Women were not as yet excluded, for he considered their presence essential to the cultured life, but any tendencies in the direction of a normal love affair must have been damped by what happened to an innocent young girl called Dorothea Ritter, with whom it was thought he had had a mild flirtation. The supposed affair was broken up by his father, on whose personal orders the inoffensive girl was publicly whipped in front of her father's house, and then at all the corners of the town before being sent to lifelong imprisonment. Jesus Christ. This wicked cruelty was typical of the sadistic father, but seems to have had little effect on the son, who had really cared very little for poor Dorothea. Whilst Frederick William's cruelty put him in the international championship class for sadism, Frederick's own sadistic tendencies were of a milder nature. True, Voltaire, in an unpleasant book about his patron's sexual propensities, alleged that Frederick liked to watch deserters being flogged. This was probably pure malice. Frederick's cruelty was of a different quality. He took delight in pouring scorn on men's ideas and spiritual aspirations, and in outraging people's finer feelings with bitter jokes and profane language. This kind of verbal cruelty and pleasure in scandalizing people by salacious and blasphemous talk in inappropriate company is said to be characteristic of men of disordered or weak sexuality. Another unpleasant trait was his exaggerated teasing and bullying, especially of two men, Baron Gundelin, whom Miss Mitford suspected of being a masochist who secretly enjoyed it, and later in his life his friend, the Marquis d'Argens. Incidentally, this sort of thing was the only real flaw in the character of our own much-loved and much-loving King Edward VII. Frederick, like Edward VII, remained a kind and human man with a compellingly charming nature, which won him the affection of men and women, though here the comparison ends. As we have seen, Frederick liked to include women in his circle at Rheinsberg, for he thought that cultured conversation was difficult without them. But his marriage changed all that. He kept up a long friendship with the Duchess of Saxe-Gotha, to whom he wrote many letters, and there were other charming women with whom he exchanged gallant poetical fancies. One was Maria Antonia, Electress of Saxony. He wrote a long poem in French on a young lady of Breslau with a Benedictine soul, indicating that he was ready to sacrifice Mars for Venus, but he discussed the poem with his friend Decat, we'll call this guy Decat, and it was plainly just an exercise in poesy and was sent to no flesh and blood girl. Otherwise, women were shut out of his life, even his wife. In fact, otherwise women were shut out of his life, even his wife. In fact, especially his wife. She was Princess Elizabeth of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, whom he had never seen, and against whom he worked himself into a passion. It was hard on him to be ordered to marry this plump, plain girl, and to be given no choice of wife, but he obeyed his father to the point of marrying her, but then left her virtually forever. What's this footnote? I don't even see it on the page. That's why I didn't. Oh, there it was right there. She proved to be an angel compared with the appalling Caroline of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, chosen for poor George IV, imagining her to be a wronged woman. The man in the street took her side against the unpopular king. When Wellington was compelled by a crowd of toughs to say God bless Queen Caroline, he said, "Well, gentlemen, since you will have it so, God bless Queen Caroline, and may all your wives be like her." She, poor soul, fell in love with him and adored him all his life. A tribute to his lovable nature, it was said that Frederick William had to force the unwilling bridegroom to enter the bridal bed, in which he remained for 1 hour, thereafter dressing, and appearing publicly in the gardens at Salzthal. He had told his sister, "I will keep my word and marry the lady, but then it will be bonjour, madame, et bon chemin." After the wedding, he wrote to Wilhelmine, "Thank God it is all over." And thank God this section is over just because. Goodbye, bruv.